This podcast contains potentially adult language, adult themes, definitely drinking, and possibly sexual context. Listener discretion is advised. Okay, we are here, drinking with authors. Woo! I am your host, Erica Lance. With me today is
J.M. Paquette.
And our guest today is S.M. Stirling. Woo! Let's talk about what we're drinking. I actually, in honor, found a bottle of Malbec called The Girl and the Dragon.
Awesome.
Very fancy.
So this was part of the, anyway, I themed it. I don't know if it's any good. I haven't actually tried it yet, but I did put it in one of our tumblers, which I will send to you, SM. Jen, what are you drinking that's boring and not applicable for this podcast?
I'm drinking tea. It's holiday black, and I like poured it into a my little
Did
fancy.
You steep it?
I steeped it and everything. I made it myself. It was in a bag, and I had to make it into tea.
Yes. Jen's allergic to alcohol, so she's boring. SM, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a modest but perfectly drinkable California Merlot.
Ooh.
It's not the best wine I've ever drunk, but then I was given the best wine I ever drank.
Which was?
A Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1917. I went to a science fiction convention in Buffalo, and this guy had just gotten a crate of it from his dad. And he gave all the authors a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1917 with dinner, but he didn't tell us what it was, and it had been decanted. So we were all sitting there having a perfectly ordinary upstate New York prime rib dinner with Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1917. That was like in the early 90s. It was perfect, not oxidized at all, just like drinking flower petals. And I priced it when I got back here afterwards, being gross and crass, and it was $1,500 a bottle.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm glad I didn't know that while I was drinking it, because I would have been consumed with guilt or something.
Oh my goodness. Oh, by the way, this is actually pretty good. So girl and dragon. Okay. But I had a conversation like this the other day about wine, because the most expensive wine bottle I've ever had was like $450.
Mm-hmm.
I was not wowed. It was not like something. I don't know what kind of wine drinker you are, but I'm like, people who save wine. I love people who are like, I have this to save my wine bottle. I'm like, no, like,
no, I just drink it because I like it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I like the taste, and this $400 bottle was not good, but this $19.99 bottle of Girl is
yeah.
fancy.
Well,
I splurged.
I drink wine because I don't like, I like beer, but it makes me feel full very rapidly. And distilled liquors activate my superpower.
Is that sleeping? What is the superpower?
Getting tipsy in unbelievably modest amounts of alcohol.
Yes. I know that's a superpower for.
I had a glass of Glenlivet once at a convention, and I put on a kata demonstration in the hall all the way down to the elevators. And then I did the button with my toe.
Was it good though?
Yes, it was. It was excellent.
All right, good.
But it was whiskey, not wine.
I'm a huge whiskey fan too. That's the other thing. I was Jonathan Mayberry is like, we're gonna drink whiskey at the next Dragon Con, and I'm like, this is gonna be an unfortunate event for one or both of us. I'm not sure which, but I don't think either one of us will yield.
You go to Dragon Con?
Oh yes.
Me too. Every time they hold it.
Well, and hopefully I'll see you there. I've talked to Jody and anyway, I'm excited that they're doing it in person this year. I'm definitely going to be there. Super excited, fan. And I now, as having done this podcast, I get to go nerd out with all the authors, and I am so excited about that.
Well, I'll see you there.
Yes.
It's a great con. Lots of energy.
Oh yeah, and costumes. I'm a huge fan of costumes. Okay, let's talk about books for a minute. For anybody who lives under a rock who doesn't know you, will you talk a little bit about what you write?
I write science fiction and fantasy, which is a broad church. I've read a lot of alternate history. I wanted to be a history professor for a while, and then I discovered what you had to do to become a history professor. And I decided that writing fiction was a more reliable income. But I'd always wanted to write. And I was telling people stories and making things up when I was like 4 and 5 years old. Was convinced I was Ming the Merciless for a while. Saw the Flash Gordon serials at the local school. This was back in the, oh God, early 60s. Shows my decrepitude. I write a lot of historically grounded science fiction and fantasy. There's an old joke that world building is good occupational therapy for lunatics who think they're God.
I love that.
And one of the drawbacks of world building is that the world tends to take on too much of your own flavor and become too uniform and not complex enough. The real world is just like irrefragably real, and it doesn't have to be credible. Fiction has to be credible. The real world can just exist. And the more you know, one of the miracles of the American educational system is that it makes history dull, because it's a collection of the greatest stories in history. I'm doing a series now. Started out with Black Chamber a couple of years ago. That's the one that got the Dragon Award for Best Alternate History in 2019. Continued with Theater of Spies and Shadows of Annihilation, and the one that coming out in March. Do the obligatory plug.
Please. Up a little bit, up a little bit.
Little bit.
There we go.
Oh, very cool. You know what's funny is
wow.
I have a book box company, and we put Black Chamber in our science fiction box.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good
one.
one.
It is science fiction. Alternate history is a subgenre of science fiction.
Well, yeah, so it's good stuff.
It's got Teddy Roosevelt in it. He's not the major character. He's a framing character.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to prevent Teddy Roosevelt from taking over anything he's in.
Mm-hmm.
And
For sure.
I think if he was here, he'd say the same thing.
Oh yeah, people remarked on that at the time. There was a comic at the time. His persona was a Chicago Irish barkeep named Mr. Dooley, and he later became a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. They really took to each other, but he came to Teddy Roosevelt's attention because he suggested a series of alternate titles for The Rough Riders, which was Teddy's book about the campaign in Cuba. And I'd call it The Doings of a Brave Man by an Eyewitness. If it was me, I'd call it Alone in Cuba. And a little later on, Teddy was at a reception, and this young lady came up to him and said, "Oh, I've read all your books, Colonel Roosevelt." And he said, "Oh, that's interesting. Which one did you like best?" And she said, "Alone in Cuba."
That was awesome. I would have been like, "Did you bring it so I can sign it?"
Yeah. So he used to tell that story himself. He knew that he tended to crowd other people out of a room. So.
Wow.
But he's the only American president, well, he was vice president at the time, who's ever leapt on a 215-pound cougar and stabbed it to death with a Bowie knife.
Like you do. Like,
yeah.
That's what I'm.
Well,
that's my plan next Sunday. So.
Yeah, he said that was the only useful thing he'd done while he was vice president, besides remembering to breathe.
He's got some great one-liners.
Oh my goodness.
He's also the only American president who rescued a kitten from dogs on the street, picked it up, and then walked around the White House neighborhood for an hour to find it a new home.
Oh.
Yeah, cool. No vice president would do that now.
No, he's president when he did that.
Even president, it'd be interesting to see in modern history somebody do that.
He's also the only president to lower his own children from a second-story window in the White House on a rope made of tied together bed sheets. They were playing a game, Frontier Fort, and he really got into the spirit of it. So he was seen lowering them to the ground out the window with this rope made of bed sheets tied together.
Oh my goodness. I would imagine the equivalent of Secret Service if it existed at that time.
Oh, it did. It did. And
they went
He made them very unhappy.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I could see that. Okay. What is the first book you ever released? What is the first piece of fiction you ever released?
It's called SNOWBROTHER. 1984. Sold it in 83. That was the first book I sold. I sold it to Sheila Gilbert. She was at Assignat NAL at the time. It was a post-apocalyptic book originally, but she called me and said that they wanted it to be fantasy. So I added an evil shaman and 20,000 words. So it came out as post-apocalyptic fantasy. It was an early effort. I wrote it while I was in law school, so it's full of hatred and violence. But I think it was not bad. It's not bad. And then she left and went to Daw, and I was orphaned, as they call it in the trade. And the replacement, I waited 6 months because she'd said they wanted to take the next 2 books in the series, and I called up 6 months later because I hadn't heard from them, and her replacement said, "Well, we got some reprint rights on a bunch of Arthur C. Clarke books, so we're bumping some of our mid list, maybe next year."
So what did you do?
I wrote something else and sold it to somebody else.
Okay.
Did you ever do the book 2 and 3 of that?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I did them as collaborations with some people I was in a writers group with at the time.
And he'd say the names of those people, and they're all like amazingly famous people.
No, that's good. Shirley Meyer and Karen Werstein. Both pretty good writers, but it's a crapshoot whether you get going in this field. A total and absolute crapshoot. You hit the right editor on the right day. But the problem is, that writing is one of those professions like acting that everybody wants to do. Like, you go to Hollywood, the Hollywood neighborhood in LA, and the waiters are all actually actors. Here in Santa Fe, it's mostly the waiters are mostly artists. There's a painting in my hallway that I bought from the barista at a coffee shop I like to hang out at. You order veal scallopini, and the waiter tells you about her sculptures that she welds together in her backyard. It's like that. And writing is like that in spades. There are millions of people who think that they can be writers, and 2 or 3% of them actually finish some piece of fiction and send it in. And well, I had a friend who was a first reader at a publishing house for a while, and she had what she called her funny file.
Oh.
Yeah. Let's see. There was an 800-page epic about a guy who was born on one of the sea islands off the coast of Georgia after his family was shipwrecked, and he was raised by the family goat. I quote, "Being raised by the family goat had took its toll of him."
800 pages of this?
Yes. There was a 600-pager about an undersized paper bag from a factory in Louisville, Kentucky that had self-esteem problems. No, I'm not kidding.
God, we know you're not kidding.
Seriously.
It's just that is a horror story from a totally different way of looking at it. Jeez, that's terrible.
But my favorite was The Organ, which was a Kafkaesque tale about a guy who suddenly turned into a 6-foot penis overnight. And his wife rushed him to the county hospital. And the head of the county hospital found that the organ had a mysterious influence on people's minds and plotted to use it to take over the county medical system. Not the world, just the county medical system. And this was done dead seriously. I thought at first when I was looking at it that it was some sort of riff on Kafka, but this guy was dead serious.
Well, if you go to any Vanity Press or some self-publishing, you find these little delightful things. We have friends that work at Vanity Presses and stuff, and sometimes they send us the covers the authors are insisting upon. And the last one she sent us was something like Dave is Jesus or something, and it's a middle-aged gentleman not wearing a shirt, holding his arms out, but like wearing like fluorescent shorts in his living room, and you know, he has
Swing
a,
and a
a
miss.
dad bod and they literally had to ask 3 times. Now you're super sure this is the image you want to use. Yeah, it conveys my book's meaning. And I'm like, cool. Well, that will prevent people from picking it up. So you do you. You do you,
Yeah.
my friend. Like,
My God, I was tempted to gouge my eyes out, but it wouldn't help now that the image is in my head. Oh, God.
yeah, and you're welcome. And you're welcome. So what do you think of you've been a writer since before the whole like self-publishing boom, and now the, you know, all this stuff that has kind of happened, and you know, talking to like Melinda Snodgrass and things like that, it's been interesting to see their views and their takes and Bill on the change of the book industry. What are your thoughts on the change of the book industry?
Yeah, well, Vanity Presses, as you mentioned, used to be the kiss of death. You weren't a serious writer unless you'd gone through the majors. That's changing rapidly. I think Aragorn was one of the first ones that was self-published and did very well. So nowadays, it's a perfectly legitimate path to publication. Publishing has changed a bit itself. The majors have consolidated until there's only about 4 of them now. 5 if you count Bain, and I do. I started out at Bain.
As you should. I agree with you on the Bain.
Yeah, and they've been, businesses go through a cycle. They start out being run by innovators or people who are just like passionately committed to the business. Ford, Edison, you know, people like that, or most publishing companies get started by people like that, like Jim Bain. And then they get taken over by accountants. And when they get taken over by accountants, they start going downhill because, you know, not accountants, MBAs, let's say. And MBAs can't do what they think they can do. They think they can manage anything and make a profit off it. And what they generally do is cannibalize the business and then it dies. Publishing is going through a surfeit of MBAs right now. They think that somehow they can turn it into a high return on capital business by publishing only blockbusters. But the fact of the matter is that no one knows what's going to be a blockbuster. Unless, you know, the author has had 15 blockbusters, then they're Stephen King and you can count on getting good sales. But other than that, you can't, because there are, as I said, an infinite number of bad books. A good editor, good first readers even can screen those out, you know, the unreadable stuff, the stuff that you just sit there and giggle helplessly as you read. But there is so much good stuff written and so much good stuff even published, perfectly, you know, respectable stuff. And you can't tell what's going to take the public's fancy. You just can't predict it, but MBAs think they can. One reason I'm publishing this book, Daggers in Darkness, with Ring of Fire Press, which is a small press, just started by Eric Flint, does some good stuff. They've got some good authors, Cecilia Holland, Dave Brin, Dave Weber, me, Dave Drake.
They got a lot of Daves. They definitely onboarded in the Dave department. So points for them
well,
on
you
that
know,
one.
names go through cycles.
Yeah.
But you know, I've had some New York Times bestseller list books, but none of them have been the first book in a series. Mostly 4th, 5th, or 6th. But the MBAs don't want to wait. So with this series, it was selling perfectly respectably, but they're not interested in respectable numbers. So they wanted to can the series because it hadn't taken off in the 1st or 2nd book. I insisted on a contract for 3 books, for among other things, for that reason.
I think it's good what you said there. So we have a small publishing company we started last year. It's called Four Horsemen Publications, and we're series based because I think people don't realize that authors need to have a volume of work out. You know, every now and then they get a Fault in Our Stars or one of these books that like, woo, and Oprah likes it and everybody thinks it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But most of the time it's getting a series of work out. And I think that's an important message. And it doesn't have to be a book series so much as also a quantity of books. And who was it? Heather Graham was saying that. She was saying that there used to be a time when you were signed that you'd be signed for 2, 3, 4 book deals, right? And now you're signed for 1 book and they're like, how good is it doing? Not good enough. We don't want book 2. And you don't have a shot.
These are people who haven't read a book since it was assigned to them.
Yeah, they think of books as just another business, and it's not.
It's not. Publishing is a wonky industry, and it's low return. 5% is the average, and it's been the average for over 100 years. But every once in a, waves of MBAs come in and they think they can turn it into a high return business, and they can't. Also, it's not an industry. Publishing is an industry. Writing books is a handicraft. It's one of the last individual handicraft industries, and you just can't run it like even a Perry Rodin book, that German series with infinite numbers takes a commitment that is not the same as turning out a standard product. Even L. Ron Hubbard did some good work in his early days. I'm doing some intros for a republication of some of his early work, and he was not bad by the standards of the pulps. He wrote one I'm doing called Typewriter in the Sky. Mm-hmm. And it's about a guy who he's this miserable hack author, and he falls into a book, literally. He realizes suddenly, he wakes up and he's a character in one of his in a book that would be one that he would write, and he's the villain. It's a pirate romance, and he knows what's going to happen to him. And every time he tries to make an overt breakout, this typewriter, he can hear it faintly typing up in the sky, and it forces him back into the plot.
Oh, wow.
And the book is about how he figures out a way to win, even though he's the villain. And the typewriter in the sky is watching him. And it's actually hilarious.
It makes me think of Stranger Than Fiction, the movie where Emma Thompson is narrating, it's Will Ferrell's life, mm-hmm. and he can just hear what has to happen to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Hubbard came up with it like 70 odd years ago.
Yeah.
And there's no new plot points. What is it saying? Mediocre writers have influences. Great writers steal.
Yeah.
And I steal a lot.
So was your first book that got published, was that the first book you ever wrote? What was the first thing you wrote?
I had a writing class in high school that was actually valuable. Mm-hmm. There were 3 of us and the teacher, and he gave us a ream of paper. This was back when you did things hard copy. He gave us a ream of paper at the beginning of the year, said, you're all going to write a book over the course of the coming year. We'll meet once a year, once a week, and read over what each of you has done, and then you can come to me whenever you run into a problem. And I wrote a book. It was awful. Imagine the bastard child of Tolkien and Robert E. Howard, with a dose of everything from the pulps and a strong Edgar Rice Burroughs influence. But by God, I learned a good deal writing that book. You can't learn to write fiction anyway except by writing fiction. Reading helps. Writers' groups can help. I've been in a number of them. Getting good critique from an editor helps, although you don't get that as often these days because they're overworked and underpaid, and almost all of them are women. Why is that not a surprising coincidence? But anyway.
You're talking to somebody who does editing and stuff. That's why Jen is just smiling. She's an editor as well. And yeah.
And it's all piecemeal.
The only male editor I've ever had is Jim Bain. And we had a terrible fight. But that's why I left Bain Books. I may be doing some more stuff for them in the future. It depends on what they think of some proposals. But
what was it about the Oxford comma?
No, it was about my character.
Gotcha.
My lead character in Island in the Sea of Time was black and female and gay and in the Coast Guard. And for some reason, this just pushed Jim's buttons. He wanted me to make her into a white guy from Montana. And I told him I've already got a white guy from Montana in this book. And he said, yeah, but he's the villain. And we fought about it. And eventually we just came to a parting of the ways.
Gotcha.
Jim was a very smart guy. And when he didn't have his buttons pushed, he had an intuitive sense for books in this genre that was matchless. But when his buttons were pushed, things could get awkward.
How do you?
And the book's now in its 31st printing. So I was right and he was wrong, and I get to sing the "I Was Right" song.
There it is.
Have you had a lot of that through your time in as an author, that people have pushed back on characters? Because I think that's one of the things that is advantageous if you go the self-publishing route or whatever, is that generally you pick the editor differently and you can not have your entire vision necessarily trampled by their opinion.
Well, you can always shift the book, particularly if it's the first in a series. I shifted, I got Sheila Gilbert at Penguin.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I got 2 offers on Island in the Sea of Time after I pulled it from Bain and paid back the advance. I got one from Sheila Gilbert, not Sheila Gilbert, sorry. Oh my God, I shouldn't be drinking like this. My memory is blanking.
That's okay. My memory's like that before I start drinking. I just blame the wine. It's good.
Anyway, there was a new author at a new editor at Penguin, and I got an offer from Tor. Tor was going to do an original hardcover. The new author, how can I blank on this? I've known her for years. Oh God. And my agent, who is a god among agents, Russ Galen, oh God, I remembered his name, thank God, said, if you send it to Tor, it will disappear in the ruck because Tor is a very big company. But this line at Penguin is just starting. The editor is young and hungry. She'll push it. And it was the best piece of advice I ever got. The advances were roughly similar. So I went with her at Penguin, and that really started my career because that was the first really successful book I had. I'd done a lot of collaborations with Jim and at Bain, and collaborations are not bad. There's one way to get your name mentioned, and you learn. I got outlines from Dave Drake when I was doing collaborations with him that were 40 to 50,000 words long. Now I'm a pantser, the seat of my pants author, but these were like every scene was outlined, and Dave does that for himself too. That's the way he works, and it was awesome, and it was actually strangely liberating. I didn't have to think about the plot. I didn't have to waste 20,000 words going in a direction that turns out that it wasn't doable. I just wrote the book and concentrated on things like world building and characters and describing scenes. And it was actually very liberating. And I learned a lot about structuring books from Dave. Structure is like, 9/10 the iceberg is underwater, but it's absolutely essential for a book. You can tell when a book's got a bad structure, and no amount of good paragraph by paragraph writing will make up for it.
Oh my God, I agree with that 100%.
Yes.
But also, as a pantser, I'm curious because I'm lucky that I write in horror is my genre and chick lit erotica, so I can get away with not having so much world building. Mm-hmm. That may be by design, who knows? But you are doing sci-fi and fantasy. There is world building. How do you balance that with your pantserness?
Well, as I said, I did a dual major when I was an undergrad, history and English lit. And I discovered that I discovered a long time before that, actually, that I love doing historical research. I showed you my library. Here,
it is amazing. Oh my gosh. You're going to be so jealous, Jim, when he does this.
I know.
Like so jealous. This is like
that's
I spend $6,000 a year on books, and most of them are nonfiction. History in particular, history, anthropology, archaeology, that sort of stuff. So I love doing research, and I love detail in the world building in books I read. I have to keep this under control because otherwise, they'll be reading my notes. So, developing a way of getting the information across without too much in the way of info dumping is a skill you have to learn. But, when I was writing my first book, at one point, I had a map drawn, and it was set in North America, post-apocalyptic North America, admittedly. And I had this map that was the entire living room of the apartment I was in at the time, which was a slum apartment, classic starving artist stuff. And I had 2 hookers living below me, and they and their clients got into very, very loud fights. Anyway, there was a hole in the kitchen floor too. I had this map of the area the action of the story was taking place in, which was basically Minnesota, and it was covered the entire living room area. I made it by taping 8.5 by 11 sheets together. And I was crawling over it, writing details on the long distance trade in flax. And I said to myself, Steve, enough with the research, write the book.
It's time.
Yeah, it's time. So I just basically wrote it. I did it on a manual typewriter. This was back when cut and paste meant cut and paste.
Did you have carbon paper?
No, because I made too many corrections. Later on, with my first advance, I got a electronic typewriter that did one line.
The line.
Yeah. I blew the entire advance on that. You know, at the time I was doing pickup jobs. I picked tobacco for a summer. I actually slept in a migrant laborer's barracks. That was an experience. I was a bouncer for 2 nights. It wasn't the violence that put me off. It was the getting puked on. Because when you grab a belligerent drunk around the waist and drag them out, guess what happens? Yeah, that denim jacket was never the same. But I blew the entire advance on this Olivetti one-line electronic typewriter, and it actually helped. And it had a whiteout cartridge that you could put in, and I got really fast at whipping the whiteout cartridge in. I was proud of my manual skill on that. But yeah, I just learned to control my world building obsessions. Actually, history is a good way to do that. Sometimes people are familiar with the history, like that's why a lot of alternate histories deal with World War II or the American Civil War, but those have been done to death. But history is good for that because, you know, the real world hangs together, even if you're mutilating and mutating it, better than anything you can actually come up with. A good fictional universe should be as ample for writing stories in as the real universe, and we haven't run out of room to write stories in the real universe. Although, if you're doing historical or alternate historical, you can do that if you're not careful. Patrick O'Brien wrote a series, the Aubrey Maturin series. They're called great stuff, but he did too many time skips before he realized how popular it was going to get, and he ran out of Napoleonic War. So 1812 and 1813 happened 3 or 4 times if you read carefully. He just had to do that. So I took that to heart when I read the series, and I decided to leave ample room in any series I did for sequels if the book took off. You can do that inconspicuously. Give your protagonists or your villains or both children, for example. You know, just mention, there should be a sense when you walk into a scene in a book that the universe does not consist of the room in which the scene is taking place. It should have implications that stretch out indefinitely. So you've got, you know, and that means you've got room to go to. Also, if a book feels like nothing exists but the characters and what they're doing, it gets claustrophobic to my way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
And we have to take a quick break. We will be right back with Drinking with Authors.
Oh, thank God, my aging bladder thanks you.
Sample locally sourced, quality distilled spirits in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge. At Skunk Brothers Distillery, we're family owned, brewing small batch grain to bottle spirits, just like our grandfather did back in the Prohibition era. From handcrafted bourbons and moonshine to flavored blends and cordials infused with local fruit. Join us for a tasting tour and buy Skunk Brothers spirits straight from the source.
It's all in the family at Skunk Brothers Spirits, located in Stevenson, Washington.
And we're back from that commercial break. Criminal break. It could have been criminal.
Yes, I prefer to call it a euphemism break.
Oh, euphemism break. I like that. We're back from our euphemism break here at Drinking with Authors. So, as you're going through this, and you talked before we even got on about when you were able to go full time. So when did you go? I love you. Yeah, you actually, I would like you to share the story of what you did with your tie when you decided to go full time writing.
Oh, I was working an office job as a temp at the time, legal clerking temp, and having a law degree did help me at least a little bit. I took my tie off and cut it up with a pair of scissors, and I danced through the office, singing in the rain, actually, and throwing pieces of the tie at people. And I have not worn ties except on formal occasions since. Thank God. Inventions of the devil.
you are a lawyer?
No, I'm a recovering lawyer. I had my dorsal fin surgically removed. I was actually called to the bar. This was in Canada. I'm Canadian by background. And I did my 3 years at law school and then a year of articling and then 6 months at the bar admission course. Articling is like being an apprentice, articling clerk, it's called. It's a British hangover in Canada. I articled with two guys. One was carted away screaming that things were climbing up his legs. And we found many bottles half empty around the office after that. So I switched my articles, which isn't generally done, to a firm I thought must be respectable because they were at 390 Bay Street, which is just across from Toronto City Hall.
Oh, wow.
And then I later discovered that there were 4 disbarment proceedings against the guy I was articling with at the same time. And
well, that changes things.
He and his wife were partners, and he had 3 sets of books, one for himself, one for the tax people, and one for his wife's relatives. She tried to kill me at one point, threw a heavy stapler at my head. But then she'd once called a judge an old fool to his face in open court. So she didn't really do many court appearances. He wasn't mobbed up, I'll say that about him. His name was Constantine. But some of his friends were. And
okay, wait, is this an actual fiction story? Is this real life?
No, this is real life. So I asked one of his mobbed up friends once what it was like being a lawyer for the mob, and he said, it's interesting, and the interesting work and the money's good, but you can't quit.
Yeah.
But Constantine was a piece of work. For example, he was the lawyer for an immigrant family, Portuguese immigrants. They started a little grocery business, lived over the shop, strive and succeed, the usual thing, and it burned down. And several bleach cans full of gasoline were found out back afterwards. And they didn't get any money since there was suspicion of arson, but Constantine, who held the mortgage on the property, did collect. And they came into the office. They'd rushed out in their pajamas, and the head of the family went down on his knees, literally in front of Constantine, and grabbed him by the pant legs and begged him to help them because they'd lost everything they'd spent years getting together. And Constantine put his foot on the guy's chest and pushed him over backwards. You could not put this in a book.
Oh, you could put that in a book. That is.
People would say that's melodrama. That's unrealistic. It's reality. Yes. Oh, and I was the second longest serving employee until his last secretary quit just before I got out. I got him to sign my articles early, and she took my paycheck to cash it and disappeared.
Wow.
Talk about stranger than fiction.
Did you ever turn him into a character? Is he a villain somewhere?
You couldn't do it. He was just larger than life. Like, he got the Ontario provincial legislature called into special session once. Lawyers in Canada have to do pro bono work. It's assigned on pro rata basis by the law associations of the provinces, or at least it was while I was involved in this process. And Constantine liked to defend child molesters and rapists because he said it was a challenge. So there was this guy who assaulted a retarded cleaning lady in front of 3 witnesses. The witnesses were nuns. Constantine got him off. He dug up an 1832 provincial statute saying that witness testimony wasn't admissible unless it had been directly observed, and some of the penumbra of case law on the thing said that looking through glass didn't constitute direct observation, which in the 1830s might have been, defensible because glass was often streaky and bubbly in there. So he dug this statute up, which no one had heard of for like a century, and used it and got the guy off. And they called the provincial legislature into special session to repeal this statute after Constantine got him off. I knew right then that I was getting lots of material that would be valuable in my career as a writer later on, but I just couldn't stand it any longer. So I got him to sign my articles and let me go.
It's interesting. I work in HR as my day job right now still, though.
Mhm.
And I often have to tell people what is right is not always what is correct. And justice has a lot of formalities that go with it. And you don't necessarily get justice. You get whatever the written law is and who's clever enough to figure out what the correct loophole is, because people get obviously wrongly convicted all the time, but people also get off on these ridiculous technicalities, and the judge knows they're guilty of it. Like, you have 3 nuns as testimony. The judge is sitting there going, okay, but the law and the rules say X, Y, and Z, so I have no choice but to do this action. Anyway, I could go down
the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
And he had me, Constantine was a slum landlord, among other things. He had me collecting rents for him at one point. So I was collecting, I went into the building, I touched the banister. As I walked up the stairs, the banister fell off. There were roaches scuttling over the walls, stains, the whole 9 yards. I knock on the door, and the door opens, and I can't see anyone. And I look down, and there's a guy who's 3'6" tall, or maybe a little more. And I say, l'argent pour la maison. He talks to me in French, so I reply in French. And I could barely understand his French. I did some research later, and I found out he was speaking Pier Noir, North African French. And I said, I'm collecting the rent. And he starts pointing at the stains on the walls and the roaches and all that sort of thing, and screaming at me. And then he starts trying to punch me. So I put my hand on his forehead, and he backs me down the stairs and out the door. And he was swinging right at groin level, as far as I was concerned. So I can say that I'm one of the few people who can say with complete truthfulness that he has been assaulted by a homicidal Pier Noir dwarf.
And did that wind up in a story?
Yeah, actually, I think I used that at one point. Then there was the time he sent me to serve a writ on a guy. He was being told to keep away from his wife, divorce case. It's a standard, restraining order. And I said, well, why aren't you getting the process server to do this? And he said, the process server won't go near this guy. And I said, well, what's with this guy? And he says, well, he's out on bail. And I said, what's the charge? And he said, aggravated assault on a police officer. And it turned out it was the head of Satan's Choice, who were at the time the drug dealing motorcycle outlaw gang in the area. So I had to go and knock on this guy's door and present him with a writ and tell him to leave his wife alone. He opened the door, and I was looking at his nipples, which I could see because he was wearing nothing but a leather jacket with chains. He had pants on too. They were leather too. And this beard down to his belly button. And I gave him the spiel, this says you can't come within 100 yards of your wife. And then I did a heel and toe and went away. And luckily it was early in the morning, and I could tell this person was not a morning person. But Constantine was so cheap, he hadn't given me taxi fare, so I had to take the bus back. So I was waiting at the end of the street at the bus stop.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Well, as I said, stranger than fiction.
Oh my God. Yes. You mentioned villains. Who is your favorite villain in a book?
Well, that's hard to say. If you want sheer enjoyment, Rudolf Raschenstiel from the Ruritania book, what was it? Anthony Hope, Prisoner of Zenda. That's a really good one. But if I was saying, like subtle treatment of villains, I would, in the genre, I would quote Harry Turtleduff. Harry Turtleduff does really good villains. You get inside their heads, and they actually are villains. I mean, Adolf Hitler is a speaking part in one of his books, several of his books, but you can see their motivations. Very few people are villains in their own minds. They all have reasons for what they do. They may be very bad reasons, but they're still reasons. No one just decides to get down off the stagecoach and kick a dog because it's his role. So that helps. Some of the villains in Harry Turtleduff's books are just like splendidly done, and I would recommend them wholeheartedly. Of course, I'm not entirely objective here. Harry and I are friends that have been for 20 years. No, more than 20 years now. God,
Harry is supposed to be on our show here shortly, so that'll be interesting to do.
Good. I
You
must
can put
watch
in a good word for us if you enjoyed at the end, because I heard he's a recluse. That was what I was told. You want him on the show? Yes, he's a recluse. I'm like,
Well,
okay, cool.
Harry and I were talking about this at Dragon Con, actually, about 4 years ago. He was there with Laura Turtledove, and who's written some excellent stuff herself, but can't get it published. It's a sin. But anyway, and Jan, and I was saying, well, you know, I'm a bit of a recluse, and if it weren't for Jan, I'd never talk to anybody. And Harry and Laura were just nodding and pointing at each other, you know. So I think we're both on the autism spectrum, mildly, very mildly, but we both are. You know, we're both obsessives about detail. We're not good at personal communication. I'm reasonably good at it now, but it's a learned skill. I had to like study it like anthropology.
I like that you said I have to study it like anthropology. By the way, that may be one of my favorite things you've said so far.
Anthropology is awesome. My office mate, when I'm on campus, is an anthropologist. So I've learned so many things, and all I do is tease her and tell her about dinosaurs, which is what our advising department tells our students. So, yeah. I had a question for you. So you're generally an introvert. How are you doing with COVID? Has that affected you, your writing, your schedule?
Well, it hasn't. I used to write a lot in coffee shops to get away from my cat, who was an affection whore. But
they all are.
My cat is not an affection whore. She's an asshole.
Okay.
Taps you on the forearm, saying, "I'd like some more treats, and then I'd like an hour's cuddle, please." But you know, she makes her wishes known. You know? I used to write more in coffee shops and restaurants. That gives you the advantage of having people around you, but you don't actually have to talk to them much. Mm-hmm. I always put Joe's Diner and the coffee shop I'm currently working at in my dedications, because they tolerate me muttering and making faces off in the corner. Apart from that, it hasn't made all that much difference to me, but it has brought home to me that even I, a recluse, a hermit, you know, a grumpy old man living in a cave on top of a mountain, actually had more social interaction than I thought. And you know, you miss it when it's gone, even if it doesn't take up all that much of your time.
Mm-hmm. You said you went to conventions. You talked about Dragon Con. Love Dragon Con. Advocate of Dragon Con. I'm an advocate of most conventions. How frequently did you go to conventions before COVID shut us all down and locked us in a house?
Yes, before this bad science fiction movie took over our lives. Yeah, I went to about 4 a year. I went to our local convention in Albuquerque. Bubonicon, it's called. Its mascot is a rat, because
oh, that's perfect.
Rodents in New Mexico have endemic bubonic plague. Mm-hmm. And I went to Bubonicon and World Fantasy, if possible, because I met Jan, my wife, at a World Fantasy, and I courted her at several World Fantasies, and I proposed at the World Fantasy in Memphis, Tennessee. Aww. And she accepted. And then we did our honeymoon by going to a World Fantasy. So World Fantasy has a deep place in my heart.
I would think so, yeah.
And then we'd go to others, particularly if they invited me, although just to show you how socially inept I am, I once completely forgot that I was going to be guest of honor at a convention. And they called me up on the Friday and he said, "Oh my God, I forgot."
Oh, wow.
You've got to admit it's hard.
That is awesome.
Did you make it on time?
No, because it was in Tennessee and I was in New Mexico.
Okay.
It was hideously embarrassing. Since then, I've always warned people who want me to do things that they have to keep reminding me. When I was a student, I'd sometimes leave my parents waiting for 2 hours to pick me up because I'd fallen into a book.
Yeah, I can totally. So
I'm a reasonably tolerable human being now, but as a teenager and a young adult, I was a total asshole.
So you talked about buying $6,000 worth of books a year. How fast do you read? That's a lot of books.
Depends whether I'm reading or rereading. I go much slower when I'm rereading, but if I'm reading like intensely and I'm interested in a book, I can get through 150,000 words in like 2 or 3 hours.
Wow.
It's a little faster for fiction than nonfiction.
So
Um,
what are you reading right now?
Yeah.
Well, I'm reading about 6 different things right now. I
Oh
just
my
got
goodness.
a book
Oh.
delivered today. It's a history of London as the imperial metropolis of 1900.
Cool.
And let me see, I can look up here what books I'm reading. I'm reading my own books, of course. You know, it's self-abuse. What can you say? And let's see.
Do you reread your books before you write the next in a series?
Yes, I do. You know, I write the books I'd like to read. And by God, I actually like them. Let's see. Okay, I've just read something. I'm in the process of reading Stars Collide by H.P. Munro, which is a romance. I read The Paper Daughters of Chinatown, which is a historical novel about Donaldinda Cameron and Tien Fu Wu, who were 2 women who ran a shelter for abused women in San Francisco from the 1890s through the 1930s. Really remarkable people. The Chinese domestic slavery was still a thing there then, and there was a lot of human trafficking. And they rescued thousands. Tianwen Fu Wu was herself rescued by Cameron. She had burn scars on her arms and stuff, and she was only 10 years old when she was rescued. She later went on to become one of the first Chinese-born women in America to get a college degree, and worked with Cameron for like 40 years at their shelter. Let's see. I just read a novel by Natalie Walshotz called Hench. It's written from the viewpoint of a supervillain's henchwoman.
Love it.
Oh my God, that sounds awesome.
See. I've been rereading the Flashman books. I've been rereading a history called The Transformation of the World, a global history of the 19th century. Terrible Fate, Ethnic Cleansing in the Making of Modern Europe. The Princeton Economic History of the Western World, specifically one about the Roman Empire. Cambridge History of Capitalism. Something by Ronan, Over the Woodward Wall, a book on Alma Tadema, who was a Victorian painter, a book called Empire and Globalization, Networks of People, Goods, and Capital in the British World, circa 1850 to 1914. Let's see, New Approaches to African History, Power and Landscape in Atlantic West Africa, Archaeological Perspectives, New Oxford World History. I reread the Great War series by Henry Turtledove over the past couple of weeks, and a bunch of other stuff like that. That's a reasonably representative sample.
So, you know, some really light reading.
Some of it.
Well, to me, this is light reading. I just enjoy reading it. You know?
I think that is amazing.
What-
So how many books total have you published?
About 40, I think. I've been writing about a book a year since 1984, not that old.
As a matter of fact, he's invented time travel, just in case anyone is wondering.
So how do you feel about audiobooks? Do you listen to audiobooks, or are you a paper person, or ebooks?
By preference, I'd be a paper. I do a lot of ebooks these days because, well, you saw my office. And, you know, books don't stop taking up room, and I hate getting rid of them. As a matter of fact, I think I still have the first book I ever read. It's here somewhere. I can't lay my hands on it right now. It's called Naughty Red Lion Beware. It's a classic British children's fantasy book about heraldic shield animals that come alive at night.
That's cool.
And I read it, well, I had it read to me dozens of times when I was a little kid. I insisted on having this book read to me over and over. I memorized it and learned how to read by putting my memory of the words together with the stuff on the page. So I didn't learn the alphabet. I learned to read it like Chinese ideographs. I taught myself to read when I was about 5 years old that way. I've been reading ever since, and I hate getting rid of books. I can hardly bear to do it if I read them with any enjoyment at all. So the house groans under the weight of the printed matter. I mean, this is my office, but there are bookshelves in every room in this house. And there are books piled up in the garage in boxes. So I've taken to doing ebooks because they just take up so much less room. Also, of course, I can carry thousands of books around with me when I go out, which isn't a problem this year. But, well, let's put it this way. I had 50 pounds of books in my backpack when I tripped, fell, and broke my hand a couple of years ago. There's a scar here. I tell people it's a knife fight, but actually it was reconstructive surgery on the hand. Fortunately, I fell right outside our local clinic. So I was lying there with my finger out like this, thinking, in a minute or two, that's really going to hurt. And all I had to do was crawl into the clinic, and they started to work on me. But, you know, it's a lot lighter to carry around.
Definitely.
No,
I used to read books surreptitiously when I was playing cricket at a school I went to when I was a teenager. I read Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I had it tucked in my cap. I was fielding, and I'd read the book, and the ball would go right past me, and there'd be screams of Stirling.
That is
That's
epic.
awesome.
Oh my goodness. When so you reread your books before you go. How long is your longest series right now?
15 books.
You don't reread all of those books before you start number 16.
Oh God,
do you?
no.
Okay.
That was the Dies the Fire series. It's actually longer than that if you count the lead-in 3 books from the Island of the Sea of Time series, which was 3. And then I did a spin-off. The Island in the Sea of Times is time travel. The island of Nantucket gets sent back to the Bronze Age, together with the Coast Guard ship Eagle, which is a sailing 3-masted bark. And I had fun with that. I honeymooned on Nantucket. Well, apart from the World Fantasy that year, Jan and I went there for a week early in spring before the tourist season. And a couple of years later, we go back there every spring we can, same hotel. And we were walking on the beach. Nantucket has some gorgeous beaches. We were walking, it was night. The moon was on the sea. I saw the lights of a ship going by, and I thought, you know, Nantucket feels isolated, but it really isn't. I wonder what it would take to make Nantucket isolated. And then we turned around and went back to the room, and I spent a couple of hours scribbling notes as the stuff for Island of the Sea of Time came to me. Then Dies the Fire is a modern day, well, 1998 modern day spin-off of that, and I did 15 books in that. That started out as science fiction, loosely defined, and then verged into fantasy, which is what I had in mind.
Wow. Okay, I want to ask you about your fans. So you do 4 conventions a year. Do you put yourself at a booth so fans can come up and meet you and get you to sign things?
Usually there's a signing at the conventions I go to. There is a Dragon Con. And I just I go to panels. I love doing panels. I don't particularly like sitting in a room and watching other people do panels, but I love doing it myself. And I tend to talk too much. The only person I've ever met who's worse that way is David Brin. But I enjoy.
I will concur with that. David's been on our podcast. He did most of the podcast himself. He's amazing, but he did most of the podcast himself.
Yes, we've had several fights, but I like him and I like his work. He's a good writer. You know, he's
absolutely.
But I just, go around the con and make myself available to the fans, and they can talk to me. Usually, they're very interesting people. Science fiction fans are some of the most interesting people around, and you get unbelievable amounts of recondite facts out of them, which I love.
Now that's something. So you talked a little bit about this. Obviously, you do a lot of research, which is awesome. And one of the things I have discovered. I love that you said that. One of the things that I feel like, if anybody asked me what my favorite book of all time is, it's Ender's Game. That's my favorite book of all time. I couldn't put that book down. And I love the premise, hate what they did with the movie, but that's a different subject. But one of the things that I think is interesting about a lot of sci-fi fans growing up being a nerd before being a nerd was cool is sci-fi fans are so educated most of the time and know stuff that you have to fake it very well when you're discussing things and not try to pretend like you're an expert unless you do enough research to be an expert, because they will call you on your shit if you talk about some sort of scientific theory that has any basis in real life. They'll be like, no, that's not how that works.
Like it's gotten worse since the internet too. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I've embarrassed myself a couple of times that way.
Oh, have you?
Yes, I tried to tell Liz Bourke about, she's the reviewer for Locus. She's also a PhD in history. I tried to tell her about some historical stuff once. God, that was embarrassing. I made a complete asshole of myself. But we've become reasonably friendly since. She's done some very perceptive reviews of my stuff and of other people's. I've gotten into a number of series because I've read her reviews in Locus or on her website. She's really good. And, just really perceptive. And she writes fair reviews of books which contain things she doesn't like. And there aren't many reviewers who can do that. Reviewers who can see a book, see things they don't like, yet still make a fair and objective judgment of the actual craft of the writing. And that's a rare quality, and she has it. And also she put me in my place and I needed it. Because, I'm like many people who are like polymaths and read a lot. I think I know a great deal, but I think I know more than I do. And it's good to run up against someone who has superior expertise in something I thought I knew about, which is, like it's a chastening experience, but it's good for you.
You mentioned having having a friend that's wife is a Wiccan and utilize
her brother is a Wiccan.
Sorry, brother. Okay.
Your salmon.
Yes. And well, I've been drinking most of my bottle of wine. It's fine. It's fine. I'm good. And I'm stationary, so that's all that matters. By the way, make sure you're drinking at home and not out in public. Okay. But you mentioned that. Do you have other experts that you rely upon, like that you reach out to for certain subject matter?
Oh God, yes. I've got engineers, physicists, economists. It's great. And it's surprising how many people want to cooperate with an author. Like when I did the Island in the Sea of Time book, I walked around Nantucket with a little pocket recorder. This was in 1997. And I just asked people about their lives, what they did, their businesses, all that sort of thing. And I said I was writing a book set on Nantucket. I wanted to get realistic detail. And they talked, and I got all sorts of useful stuff that was just invaluable. And particularly back in those days before the internet made research easy, although you've got to be careful about what you read. And I got scads of really, really interesting and useful stuff. I Tuckerized some of the people I interviewed, but I always asked first, of course. Like there's a machine shop in Nantucket. I wouldn't have thought it because it's a tourist destination, but there's a machine shop with like machine tools that could make more machine tools. And I talked to some of the like farmers, weavers, artisans, all sorts of things. It was really educational. But, I was writing the Dies of the Fire series. One of the protagonists is a Wiccan. Now, I'd read a fair number of books on Wicca. And, I'd gotten some idea of it, but, lived experience is always different from what you can get from doing pure research. So if you're gonna be writing about someone who has a different lived experience than you do, it's really a good idea to talk to a lot of people who have more in common with that character than you do. Heck, I use female characters more than half the time, and I talk to a lot of women. And I usually run something by them, run the stuff by them first. Jan's been an enormous help that way. So is Kier Salmon. My writing groups have mostly been more than half female, and that's always been an enormous help to me. And if I'm writing something, various different types of character, I generally try to get someone closer to the character than I am to look at it first and make sure I'm not making obvious, stupid mistakes. Like subcultures, they have their own jargons, their own in-jokes, that sort of thing. And it's it feels more authentic if you can get that. And that's part of the research for writing. And I find it interesting. I don't see how anyone can be bored in this universe, because there's just so much to learn. 1,000 years would not be enough just for this planet.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. I think it's amazing that you say that, because I think with the advent of self-publishing and all this, you can have an idea about writing a book about any sort of subculture that you have and things like that. But if you don't know anything, I have friends that are Wiccan, I have friends that are Druids, and I have friends that worship Nordic mythology.
Yeah.
I love that they throw some of the best fucking parties on the planet. Like, just throwing that out there. Like, we're having a Yuletide ceremony. There is so much mead. Let's go do this.
I got into that through Diana Paxson, actually.
Oh, really?
Who was Azatru, yeah. And she gave me some really good advice for some of the books in the Dies the Fire series, the later ones. And I had a sort of Azatru Neo-Viking settlement in northern Maine. And she gave me some really good advice on that, and she knew some people there, so I tuckerized her. She actually appears as a CRS in several of those books. I ran those by her. I ran those passages by her, of course, first to see that I was getting stuff right. And she gave me some really good advice that saved me from some embarrassing screw ups.
And I think that's important, because I think people have an idea, or even if you quote unquote, like what you said, if you research it, but actually talking to people, it's kind of like the actual doing a job. You could read about a farmer who farms corn, but unless you go out and witness it and watch it, and the famine and the all the things and the bugs and the weird stuff that can happen when you're farming corn, or even the government coming in and going, we're going to pay you to not do this. Like, people don't realize, like, that kind of stuff happens when you're farming certain products. They're like, you know what? We're actually going to pay you to plow your crops under. Right. And unless you go do that activity or witness it, and not necessarily do it, because if I went out there, no farmer would want me to do shit on their farm. But I think it's important that when you're talking about somebody's voice, you get the voice right. And it's terrible when you read something and you're like, this person has no idea what they're talking about.
Ever read a newspaper article on something that you really know about?
Oh, yeah.
And when you're dealing with periods when you can't get living testimony, reading things like collections of letters can be really illuminating. Not just about like historical details, about how the people at the time saw things, and also stuff like the different voices people talk in. Like, I've read a number of 18th century letters, and it's interesting to take an author like Sheridan or Pope, and you read their letters, and they talk in a different language than what they write in. The grammar is different. The spellings are different. Even when English became reasonably standardized in the late 18th century, there was a strong gap between the formal written language that authors used and what people actually spoke. Even, like highly educated and literate people spoke to each other. And that's illuminating and really, really valuable. And it just gets you into interesting stuff, like the rise of standardized versions of English. Before then, most people spoke regional dialect, and that was like not a class thing. In England, from the early 19th century or late 18th on, dialect has been very much a class thing. Regional dialects were lower class. Before then, that wasn't the case. But then gradually, the London upper class dialect became standard over the whole country. Sorry,
Thanks,
you were going to say something.
I was just going to say thanks, Geoffrey Chaucer, but because he did a lot for standardizing, just because his book was popular before the printing press with Canterbury Tales. My background's all in linguistics, so I just got so excited.
Linguistics
Such
is a
a
hobby.
nerd.
That was awesome.
Okay, we actually have to wrap up this episode so that we can go into literary briefs. I would like one piece of advice you would like to give authors out there?
You mean beginners?
Anybody. I'm not going to even say beginners, because the thing I've realized is people who think they're experienced authors should still be learning shit. So
Oh God,
what
yeah.
advice would you give authors?
Read a lot. And once you've been writing for a while, you read differently. I think the same thing happens to critics. You start seeing the bones. I can rarely see a movie these days where I don't know what's going to happen, because I see the plot structures. You've got to be able to step back and read what you've written as if you were somebody else. I've seen a lot of people who have, like every talent imaginable, but cannot step back and read their own stuff without superimposing the ideal version in their head on what's actually in the page. You have to be able to distance yourself from your own writing and read it as if you were coming to it fresh and didn't know all the stuff that you know and haven't gone through the whole process. That's why writers' groups can be very valuable, although they can also be a terrible trap. So, be able to distance yourself from your own stuff would be the advice that I'd give to anybody who's either doing this or thinking of doing it.
I love that. Okay, so for your fans or soon to be fans, what is the best way to find you and your stuff? And don't give your home address. I always have to say that, because somebody actually did that on one of these podcasts. They're like, well, I live at, and we had to edit that out because I was like, maybe not show up at people's homes. So what is the best way for people?
I've had that happen.
Yeah, I have no doubt. That's the crazy part. So Facebook, how do you social media? Do you social media?
Yes, I do. I try to avoid Twitter because Twitter is a dopamine receptor addictive rage machine, and it exists to make smart people stupid. Apart from that, I like it. Facebook, yeah, I'm on Facebook. There's the Stirling Appreciation Society, which is like an open group, but you got to do a few things before you can get in. I frequent that. A number of other groups, the alternate history groups, science fiction groups. I'm on Facebook myself, and I'm willing to talk to people as long as they're not complete assholes. And believe me, having been one myself, I can tell. And I have a listserv. God. Yeah, I have a moderated listserv that I intervene in fairly frequently. And as I said, there's the Facebook group Stirling Appreciation Society. Kier runs it. And she provides an invaluable function filtering out the too strange for even us people.
That's awesome. So, oh my goodness. You have been thoroughly amazing. Thank you so much for being on this podcast with us. You are awesome and funny. You are, and I'm not going to even talk about the level of jealousy I have for your office space right now, because Jen
Why
too
I bought
is
this house. This was originally a 2-car garage, and it had been converted to sort of a study by the original owners of the house. And I came in, and Janet says that I went when I saw the space, and I knew that I had to have it.
That is awesome. So thank you for being on this podcast. This has been Drinking with Authors. I've been Erica Lance.
J.M. Paquette.
And we will see you next time.